Welcome to another episode of the Dan Norton Show. Today, I am here with Steve Geller. I met Steve through the internet recently. I was calling into the David Pakman Show, and Steve had left a comment below the video that was published of my call, and he expressed interest in having a conversation, and I was interested in that as well. So here we are. So, Steve, welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself a bit to my audience and let us all know what topics you're interested in talking about?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to Dan's audience. Um, as much as you might ever see on the internet in any one of these shows, I'm just a random guy. Go to sometimes comment sections of political shows that I, agree with, sometimes disagree with. Leave comments. There had been a little bit of a back and forth between Dan and at least a couple of other commenters, or maybe in the past on David Pakman's show. He had said something in the comment section as to, like, is there a defense against this part of capitalism or something like that? I do not remember exactly. Uh, I just responded to him and said, David, I don't know what kind of time David has to do such a thing, but I'd like to take a crack at it. Again, I'm just some random person. I'm not even plugging a website. I don't have a show or anything like that, but have been following politics for much of my life. Began to get involved in having strong emotions about things during the Clinton administration, and throughout. I would consider myself pretty close to where Bernie Sanders is in terms of policy agenda. We can, do, not necessarily always in strategy, not necessarily always in focus, but in the general kind of social democrat area to the left of the Democratic Party writ large, as I would consider. I am not against capitalism in all of its, in all of its machinations. I think that social democracy, or whatever you'd like to call me, whatever, you can make whatever distinctions you would want to, is kind of a midpoint between capitalism and maybe full socialism, the authoritarian socialism, something like that. In which case, like, I believe that the you know the private sector can probably make better cars, better shoes, better microwaves than the government could or should. And I think if you notice, the people who are on my side don't really ever argue, oh, the government should be making shoes. They may argue the government should set certain thresholds so that there's not, like, poison in the dye for the shoes so that people could get sick, or that the workers are not exploited by the company in some sort of untoward way, or that it's not false advertising. You're not getting a shoe that's 1 second later gonna fall apart or kill you. Once those thresholds, reasonable thresholds in my view, have been met, then if a company wants to go and make the best shoe in the world, then I have no problem with that. And so the things I wanted to generally talk about is, I have a few things that I find problematic about capitalism, and I know that Dan, or I believe that Dan, essentially does not find things problematic about capitalism, or maybe we can get into that. And then I've seen enough of his work to, enough of his other interviews and things to have a little bit of knowledge about his view of a moral world, as you know, as a world, a society without force, and I have some issues the with the concept of the way in which I would define a the most moral kind of society. I think we may have some things to discuss there. Um, I do want to, as one thing before we proceed, I do want to, for any system like capitalism that has never been fully implemented as you would like, and you said that there's a partial model in the 19th century. You have said in the past there's a partial model in the 19th century in the United States, but it's never had all of the, it's never been completed in the vision that you or maybe Dr. Rand have suggested that it should be. Um, there is a tendency, because it doesn't exist, to fill in the gaps with the things that people would hypothetically think would happen. And um, if you're, and this is not necessarily you, and it's not necessarily capitalism, if you're rooting for a certain outcome, there can be a tendency to fill in those gaps with, oh, well, all of these things would work out correctly. All of these things would work out in a benefit which is better than what we have now. And even in the case in which, oh, well, the reason that things aren't happening in the real world the way that they would ideally happen in this society is because the government is preventing those things from happening or hindering them in some way, it can begin to sort of resemble a little bit of like uh, almost a dogmatic argument. You know, the flood comes, the rain comes while it's flooding, that's the devil, but the rain comes when it's a drought, that's God, because I always have situated that one is always good and one is always evil. And so it begins to have a little bit of that argument of theoretically, when we get into my imagination, I win every time, kind of thing. And I want to see if we can try to sidestep that in some ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So just to reply to a few points,
Sure.
some just clarificatory points. So you said you had seen some of my interviews. I assume you're talking about my interviews, not David Pakman's.
Definitely, yes. So I'll specify. I watched your 10-minute opening argument on your channel, in an argument in a debate or a discussion you had about capitalism, and this is, it was laying out, this is why the CEO is paid so much more than the workers, and this is why doing something without force is the moral way to do things, and this is why socialism requires force of other people's money, that sort of thing. And then I watched your entire uh interview slash conversation with Matt Binder, and then and a couple of pieces of other things that I can't remember from your channel.
okay.
Probably a combined total of somewhere near 2 hours worth of stuff from you. That's obviously 2 hours within a untold amount of things that you have said or believed in your lifetime, but enough to have an idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, good. I just want to make sure I was clear on that. Let's see what else. I'm just taking some notes here. That's why I'm looking over here. Just for the audience, in case anyone doesn't know, David Pakman, he's a progressive. That label is often used for him, I think. So just to kind of orient.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, definitely left of center has a lot of what I would say are progressive views, has a lot of what I would also say are liberal views, the distinction kind of being sort of inside the establishment versus outside the establishment in thinking as to whether or not we get change from moving the system in a certain direction versus whether we get change from kind of working outside the system. But I would definitely say that on nearly all matters, he's comfortably left of center.
Okay. And just one thing about Ayn Rand, you've referred to her as Dr. Rand. She didn't go to graduate school for philosophy, at least.
Okay.
I think she did have a advanced degree in something, maybe cinema, because she studied for screenwriting. She went to a film institute or something. But anyways, she's not
As you
not a
will,
doctor.
as you have already determined, I am certainly nowhere near an expert on Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand.
There you go.
I know enough about her to be able to have a rudimentary understanding of her theories of objectivism and a rudimentary understanding of the things that she said and believed throughout her life, like like a high school student might. I just don't. I haven't studied her work in any level of detail.
Okay. And so I'll just add that although she's not a doctor, she did get an honorary doctorate, I think, from maybe Lewis and Clark College. But in any case, I think she's a genius. That's my view. But just wanted to make that technical point. Have you read anything by her, or just heard about her?
No, I have. I like, other than in some level of depth, like criticisms of her and things like that. And when I say criticisms, not necessarily negative, just literary criticism of some of her things, in which I have seen excerpts within those, but no, nothing that, like, I haven't read The Fountainhead or
Mm-hmm.
other books of hers.
Okay. I think she often gets mischaracterized by commentators, so I think it's really important to read her herself to form an opinion. But I just wanted to get an idea of where you're coming from. Okay, let's see what else Oh yeah.
I'd be more than happy to never have Rand mentioned in this conversation, just because I
Okay.
don't know enough, and I'm interested in your views, and obviously I'm not equipped to.
Okay, sure. Yeah, my views are very much informed by hers, but we don't have to talk about her directly.
Sure.
All right. So you mentioned some things about the 19th century and how I said it came close, but was not perfect capitalism. And there's this idea of filling in the gaps in a perhaps dogmatic way. There's that sort of argument. So that's something we could talk about.
Sure, I can give you one example of that.
Okay.
You'd spoken about charity, and how, well, if the government weren't taxing the wealthy so much, maybe they would be inspired to give more charity to the less fortunate. And I don't see that as realistic. And of course, it's not impossible, because we don't know what would happen if the government were to melt away and there wasn't one. But I look, for example, many times within the last 40 years, the rich have had their taxes cut substantially. This is and including, just a few years ago under Trump. This is a significant windfall of extra money that there was no reason for them to necessarily believe was coming to them after this influx of money, which, again, if they didn't need for their margins necessarily. This is essentially found money as a result of those tax cuts. The amount that actually went into charity is fairly negligible. And saying, well, it's because the government was taking away so much of their tax money that they couldn't afford to give that money to charity, or they weren't inspired to do so. I don't see any fact pattern that supports that. And I see that when they did have the opportunity to take some of that money, which was their new money, and put that into charity, they just don't. And in terms of they're paying so much in taxes, it at least seems to me that the effective tax rate is actually quite low on the very wealthy right now. And you can say, well, it's not low enough, but it seems like it's close to the single digits, and they are some of the richest people in the history of the world. They would be able to find the money to be able to donate to charity if they wanted to. The government, I don't imagine, would be a significant impediment morally, or certainly not physically, for them to be able to do that. And so saying, well, we would be able to solve we may be able to solve this problem with helping the less fortunate through the charitable contributions of people that are declining to do so because the government has set up so much welfare already, and is taxing them so much, seems like that is a way to dance around the fact that it just doesn't seem like it fits any other area of the pattern that we're actually seeing. That makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, a few thoughts on that. One is, I think it might be useful to look back at the 19th century to see what happens. That's closer to the sort of model that I support.
Sure.
And I think there was a significant amount of philanthropy that people like Rockefeller or Carnegie made available to others.
Sure.
And I think not just, well, I don't know exactly what all their philanthropy went to. I know like Carnegie established some libraries. I don't know if it was, if any of it was directly given to the poor. But another consideration is there's a distinction between absolute poverty and relative poverty. So people who are poor, in quotes,
Sure.
today in America, I mean, it's nothing like what you would see in sub-Saharan Africa, right, where they're living on like $1 a day. So it might be that today's poor don't really need assistance. They're able to survive on their welfare checks, or some kind of they've already got some way to survive without further assistance from the rich people who are getting these tax cuts that you're talking about. So there might just not be a need for charity. So those are a couple points I would make about that.
Can
Maybe
I
I should just pause there.
can I push back against both of those?
Yeah,
So
sure.
I undoubtedly, and this was a long time ago, and who knows, but undoubtedly, uh, this was written from a left wing perspective. But I remember back in college, I saw an article about that was a, and I saw an excerpt of something that was from Carnegie's own words, talking about all of these parks, all of these libraries, this foundation of, this is what happens. This is what we are allowed as a society when we're prosperous, is we have all of these wonderful resources for people. And he went into detail about, you can go and do this, and you can go and do this. And then I read another excerpt, and it was, the teacher was making a point, so the two of them were linked to another, from a a critic at the time, saying these workers are working like 14 hours a day. They don't have breaks. They don't have disposable money. Their money is, their money is just barely, what they need to survive. They don't have time to go to the parks. They don't have time to go to the libraries. They're barely standing on their feet by the end of the day, and then they have to work the next day. And so I think that there is some value in the charity of giving certain things to a society which would not have them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it ever translates to the people who who it is supposedly a like a release valve, or I don't know if it is, but can be a release valve as to saying, well, we're not immoral, we do all these things, we have all of this pressure on the workers, but then we give all of these benefits to the society. Well, the workers aren't getting those benefits because of the fact that they can't take advantage of them. They're there, but they but they can't use them. I think that we should make the distinction, and I don't know how you feel about in terms of, Bernie Sanders talks a lot about percentages, the top 10% or the top 1% or whatever. There is a difference, I think, in a lot of cases between charity that goes to like, oh, we are we're giving a wing to this university, and the wing to the university is going to provide a lot of value to people in a certain economic class, and it is not going to provide a value as much, certainly not as much, to the rest of the society as using that money to fund, to fund, for lack of a better thing, food assistance. The other thing I would push back is to say, I don't, and I think maybe there are indications, maybe you may not care as much, maybe you do, about borders. There is no reason that the super rich in this country should not be taking their charity and giving to people in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't as much care as to whether or not the poor in this country happen to be relatively poor or absolutely poor, because money can go to whatever cause people want to in the name of charity, and it could help raise millions out of poverty that doesn't necessarily have to be the relatively privileged poor in the United States, for the model still to be in evidence. Because in fact, if I had $1 million to be able to give in charity, I would probably do more help in giving that to the people of South Saharan Africa than I would necessarily have in giving it to to people living in the Appalachians. But that doesn't mean that's not a reason that I should say, okay, well, some of the people that I happen to see every day don't need it, so I'm just going to keep it.
Okay. All right. So let's yeah, good. Let's get into these some more. We can go another round on these two
Sure.
points. So the first issue about poor not being able to use like the parks or the libraries, even if they are funded by philanthropists. When you were talking about that, another thing came to mind that I believe existed in the 19th century was something called mutual aid societies. And I don't know if those were run by the industrialists, captains of industry, or if they were run by others.
Sure.
But in any case, those also existed. And I want to make this point. I think it's everyone's responsibility to support himself or herself.
Okay.
And the people the number or percentage of people who can't support themselves, I think, is minuscule.
Okay.
I think it's extremely strong, like well under 1%. It's so easy to find something, at least if we have an unregulated economy and we don't have laws like minimum wage to get in the way, virtually everybody can find something to support themselves. Like even if you're disabled and you can't move around, you can sit at a computer and do data entry, and someone will pay you to do that. So I think the issue of needing others to support yourself is, I think it's pretty trivial, and I think it distracts from it shouldn't be a huge focus of attention when it comes to designing a society, as if there's this massive number of people who are going to be dying in the streets if they can't live off of coercing other people to support them. I have a higher view of people than that. I think most people, the vast majority of people, can support themselves, and they don't need any charity at all. And for the minuscule percentage of people who do need charity, I think there will be more than enough of it. It'll be abundantly available. Now, I do want to go to your second points about sub-Saharan Africa, and then I'll turn it back over to you. So the issue of poverty, like there is in sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of the world in the East, I think is due to a lack of freedom. It's not That's the primary cause. Like if there's anarchy in Somalia or something like this, it's a war-torn place. You can't have a stable society where you can produce and have property rights to what you produce and build a life for yourself. You're just constantly under threat. So what these places need, I think, are stable governments with rational policies that protect rights to property. And if you have that kind of institution in place, then these places don't need the help of other places around the world. They can do better for themselves. Now, you still might want to help them out in the near term as a kind of emergency relief for, say, like children who are born into these countries and they have it wasn't their fault that they were born into such hellholes, and that's fine. But I don't think that well, there's a whole issue of, is there a moral obligation to help out people in these sorts of situations? And that's something we could talk about. But for right now, I just want to make the point that I think the main thing that needs to happen in places that are absolutely poor, not just relatively poor, is they need a better social system with better policies, more capitalist policies that will allow them to rise up out of poverty. All right, I'll turn it over to you there.
All right, I can before I answer, I have a question.
Sure.
How, in your view, does having a minimum wage, uh, I don't remember exactly the claim that you made, that a minimum wage helps cause poverty. Is that what was that the gist of what you were asking?
I think it could contribute to poverty. Yeah.
What did you, in the last couple of minutes, in your last answer, mention the minimum wage for as a detriment on something? Do you remember what that was? And can you further explain that? Because
Yeah. So
I don't under
people,
I understand the general point against the minimum wage, which is if you allow uh if the minimum wage gets too high, then businesses with very tight margins would have to shutter, and then that costs everybody their job. I can see it from a theoretical like point of, well, you're using force to be able to declare upon a business something that they have to do, which should be voluntary. But in terms of a practical matter, I am unable to see the link between how minimum wage causes the um, lack of self-sufficiency or poverty, or what the thing that you were mentioning earlier.
yeah.
My apology.
So I think there are many people who just might not have skills to be worth it for a business to hire them at, say, $20 an hour or $15 an hour. But maybe they have the skills, very basic skills like raking leaves or shoveling snow, very simple manual labor, which maybe a business could hire them to do for, say, $5 an hour. And that could give them some very simple employment to get started. And hopefully over time, they could work their way up to higher jobs. But if you have a minimum wage set right now so that you can't hire people who are, let's say, living homeless on the streets to do these very simple jobs, and they might just be stuck on the streets. They can't start working their way out by taking these low-paying jobs.
I see. Would um so okay. The um uh, During your interview, your conversation with Matt Binder, you had mentioned that the principal reason, or a principal reason, that FDR and other progressives in the early 20th century had instituted uh, some of the vast social programs that they did was because they were influenced by Marxist other European theories of monetary theories or philosophical theories about how a society should be run. And because of that, they did all of this damage to the economy, did damage to our system that continued on throughout the decades. As far as I am aware, and maybe there are numbers obviously for all of these things, but as far as I'm aware, the there was a significant demand among the elected populace for a lot of changes to the system. It wasn't just this, this person happened to somehow sneak into office and do this thing that, against the will of the majority of the people that rejected the Marxist ideology. FDR was massively popular, was elected 4 times, would have been elected 10 times if he had been healthy enough to live that long. I think 10 is a lot, but was showing no signs in the early 1940s that his popularity had driven off a cliff. There was a little bit of a turbulence in the late 30s, but was still quite popular even after that. And the policies were, they're probably more popular now than they were then, but it wasn't some like radical overreach. And I think that those policies were called for by the general public for a reason, which is that there were holes in this net of everyone being sufficient and everyone having enough to be able to live on, to be able to do all of these things on. Now, you could say the holes were caused by the government, and so having the government use solutions to solve the holes that they created is whatever. But there was a lot of poverty that, as far as I have seen of history, was alleviated, at least more so than it had existed, by a lot of the social policies. The fact that Eisenhower built all of the highways with giant amounts of government largesse was a significant positive for not only economic growth, but just for mobility, for all of these other positive things in society that would not have happened without government intervention, because it didn't happen. I mean, it wasn't something that the people at the time, the capitalists at the time, were saying, "Wow, we need to invest billions and billions of dollars in an interstate highway system." It was an initiative that that the government undertook. The Hoover Dam, a bunch of these other things, as I have come to know them, and maybe my sources are wrong, or maybe I'm misremembering them, had positive multipliers not only for the businesses but for the society. And I think that there was a compelling reason for them to exist, that they didn't just come out of the sky one day and were put into place and then let's see how people react to them. There was a real demand for them, and that is part of the reason that when they started ramping up these things, the Democrats were wildly popular for 2 decades.
Okay. So there's quite a bit there. Let's
Sure.
see, where should I start? Well, okay, I'll just make this point first. There's something called the broken window fallacy. I learned about this term. I see you nodding, so I guess you've heard of
I
that.
know I know what it is. If you
Yeah.
want,
So just for the audience, so
sure.
in case anyone doesn't know about this, I first heard about this in Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson, where some hoodlum throws a rock through a window, and then as a result, the person's whose window that was now has to pay money to a window repairer, and now that window repairer gets this money which he can now use, and it creates this cascade of economic activity. But you don't see what you don't see is what the guy whose window was broken would have spent his money on instead, had he not had to spend his money getting back to zero, so to speak. So all these government programs, you can point to them and say, oh, look, we've got this huge highway system and we've got the Hoover Dam. Okay, yeah, but what about all the things that you don't see that money could have been paying for instead? And that doesn't even get to the moral issue. Is it right to coercively take people's money to spend what some other people think is a good idea? So I think on moral grounds and on economic grounds, there are reasons to object to these government programs. And let me also say that
can I ask one question related to that?
Yeah.
The polio vaccine. Do you believe that it was moral for that to be created? Do you believe that that would have been created in the manner and in the, something approaching the manner and the time and the distribution and whatever, if that had just been private industry had taken that that task on, or would they have taken that task on? And do you see that it was moral for it to be distributed? I don't know if it was mandatory or if it was voluntary, but it was certainly as far as I have learned history, saved a lot of people's lives.
I don't know the history of the polio vaccine and how it was funded, but I do think in general, innovation increases under a free market system, and coercion interferes with innovation. So I think the rate of innovation, including of things like vaccines, is going to be higher under a free market system than when you have coercion. I was thinking of the COVID vaccine. There was a that was produced, or the mRNA technology, I think, that was at the heart of the vaccine, I think was produced by, I forget the name of the person, but I think she was Yaron Brook has done shows on this. He's a podcaster, an objectivist podcaster, and he's talked about how government interference has slowed things down and made it harder for progress to increase. So maybe I should just refer people to his show on some examples of this. But in general, I think the rate of innovation and discovery is going to increase when you have more freedom. And there was tremendous innovation in the 19th century when the U.S. was at its peak, I think, in terms of economic freedom.
Do you have any sort of knowledge of the history of the of insulin for diabetes?
I know almost nothing about that.
So diabetes was insulin was developed for extremely cheaply. I don't remember the history of it exactly either, but in the it was something that the people who developed it were fairly insistent that it just be almost given away for free, given away for $1, because it was so important for a society where there had been more and more so an epidemic of diabetes, partly the food supply, partly people's choices in a society that was more computer run than agriculturally run or whatever. In the 90s, insulin was selling for $20 a vial, and now it's selling for hundreds and hundreds of dollars a vial. The government had no role in raising those prices. You can say, well, if the government had it, but we already had the drug. This was not about research. This was not about stifling innovation. We already had the drug. Any government intervention, which has been called for by diabetes activists for years, would almost surely be to negotiate the price so that the price was lower than it is right now. You could say that government is incompetent in doing that. You can say, how dare the government use force to tell the tell the EpiPen people how much they can charge, but it is an absolute fact that people are dying and dying and dying from not being able to afford insulin, and then they don't have it. They use less of it than they're supposed to, and they die. Um, I would venture to argue that in a case like that, not only would it be more moral for us to mandate a system by which the people who need insulin, because they're not being lazy, they have a disease which in some cases, some cases it's diet, but in some cases they're born with it. There's nothing they can do. Um, they have a disease. I think that a competent society should have a government that does whatever it needs to do to be able to see that those people are able to get health for that disease. And it's not, in that case, any sort of a question of the government stifling anybody. It's just about making sure that there isn't price gouging, because insulin in other countries sells for much cheaper than it sells for here.
Okay. So a few thoughts on that. I think intellectual property is important, and I do remember this
I'm sorry
this coming up.
Remember, the people who invented it specifically wanted for it to be next to free. That was their property. They
Okay.
wanted to give it away. It was corporatized essentially, and then the corporations are like, we're not giving it away for free. We're giving it away for maximum profit. Just want to make that distinction in terms of intellectual property.
Sure. Yeah. So I was going to make this point in connection with the COVID vaccine. I think there was a push to take over the property rights of the people who had invented this. And I think if you do that, that de-incentivizes pharmaceutical companies from coming up with the next drug. So if they know that they're not going to be able to profit from this drug, then where's their incentive going to be to continue to innovate? So that's a way in which I think government coercion stifles innovation and makes people worse off. Now, as for insulin, I as I said, I don't know the history of it, but just going off of what you told me. So if the innovators or the creators of insulin had a property rights to their creation, and they decided that it should be free. I mean, I think they should be free to do that if that's the choice. That if they don't want to profit off of it and they want to just give it away for free, I think they should be able to do that. So, but you are saying that corporations somehow came into possession of the property rights of the insulin, and then once that happened, they increased the prices.
I am that part I'm unclear on, whether or not they had given that for larger distribution than they themselves were able to give it to people, or whether or not corporations just copied the formula and had their own brand of it. I don't know the details of that. I understand that that's could be the sticking point of a philosophical argument as to whether or not this was right or wrong, but I look at the health argument, and I look at the fact that the way to be able to get insulin in the United States right now is to pay a gigantic amount of money, far more than other countries pay, to get something which is a life-saving drug for people that did not in any way cause, like, they didn't fail to do something they should have done. This is an aspect of their life that they aren't able to control. In today's world, in order for them to stay alive, they have to pay a gigantic amount of money for this product, and I don't think that it is moral that the company is allowed to charge for that product because they know that nobody has any option but to pay for it.
Okay. So uh there's an issue of morality, which you're bringing up, and you said like they're not at fault. Um, but I'm also not at fault if someone else has some disease or like cancer. If someone gets cancer, I mean, it's tragic, but it's not someone else's fault. I think the thing to do, if you're in that sort of situation, is to seek out a voluntary charity. It's not like you're necessarily going to die. There are philanthropic organizations which raise money for people in these conditions, like I don't know what it's called, the Ronald McDonald House for Charity for Cancer. But there are organizations that provide support for people in these sorts of conditions. But
And I,
also, I want to just one other point. I think the healthcare industry is very regulated. I don't know exactly how it affects the issue of insulin, if at all, but that's something I would want to look into. Like, what are all the regulations that might be affecting something like the price of insulin? And would it, if we had an unregulated healthcare industry, and we didn't have things like Medicare and Medi-Cal and the FDA, which I think are very influential in the way the healthcare industry operates, like what would the price then be? That's something I would want to look into.
okay. Can I ask? Um, there are. I'm gonna articulate it as 5 issues that I see with capitalism. We're discussing the 5th one basically, which is the sort of winners and losers argument. Sort of what happens to the losers who are not able to make it in the market and not able to sustain for themselves. And we've gone into a little bit of discussion of, you don't think that it's a bigger problem, and everyone should be able to sort of sustain themselves. What happens in a capitalist society if the Ronald McDonald Foundation is simply doesn't have enough money, and you just don't have people that happen to want to volunteer enough money to be able to deal with something that is a crisis for those people who don't have the resources? Is it just, well, life is life, and things are difficult and you die? You can't force anybody to give more. There's no government money that is coming in to offset to like take care of the rest of the balance. Is it just the best and the brightest get health care, and that the best and the brightest of the people remaining, and then everyone else is out of luck? How does that happen in your ideal society?
Yeah, well, I don't think
Charity money
my
go around.
so in my ideal society, I think it's best for everyone. I think there's going to be fewer people who need charity, and the rate of innovation to find things like cures for cancer or diabetes is going to be higher. So I think it's going to be best for everyone. But what there's not going to be is equality in terms of wealth equality. There will be equality under the law. No one's going to have special rights, but not everyone is going to have equal wealth or equal income. And I don't see that.
That happens now. We do not have anything close to wealth equality of outcome, even with all of the welfare programs and social programs. That is a drop.
Yeah, and I think I don't think that should be a goal. That we should strive to have equality in terms of wealth. I think the kind of equality that matters is equal rights, where everyone is equal before the law and no one has special privileges to force other people to do certain things. As long as you're not forcing anyone else, then you should be able to do what you want. And that's the sort of equality. No one is being forced to support others. Everyone is equal in the sense of they're free. They're not being coerced.
So let's to put a pin on that, I don't know, like people, uh, people on the right tend to characterize the left as looking for equality of results in terms of wealth. I don't know of a single person with the slightest bit of power in the United States, or a single significant media personality, including online podcasts, whatever, that actually believes that we should have equality of outcome in terms of wealth or even in terms of income. Just that the threshold of the things that everybody gets as what they would consider to be sort of universal basic sustenance is higher than zero. And then from that point on, no one is saying, you mentioned LeBron James sometimes in your arguments, there is nobody saying that LeBron James should make as much money as the sixth guy off the bench for his team. But, and maybe all professional athletes make too much money. I'm not sure I agree with that, but they certainly make more than a lot of people working harder jobs than they do. But that we don't have so many people that are one emergency away from bankruptcy, or are losing their houses because they can't afford medical care, things like that. So I think that when you said it would be good for everybody, the entire society, to do this, the reason that I think that the insurance company in a moral society would be spurred on to innovate the next drug, even if they're not making a profit, is because they felt it would be good for everybody. Who knows when the next pandemic is going to infect their children? We don't know, because we don't know what the next strain is and how deadly it's going to be. We do know that if we have some kind of system in place to be able to deal with infectious diseases, we are most likely all going to be in a better position, regardless of anything related to profit, because there's less people coughing on you if more people are treated for this disease. And the more people that are treated for this disease is going to be a function of whether or not your pharmaceutical company is able to get a cure out there. Same thing with so many things in society, in my view, that the more that people treat things that don't necessarily affect them but help other people, the more likely it is that those things don't spiral out of control to a point at which they are affected by them. It's fine to have a fire department and say, okay, well, you're not gonna, this person didn't pay their money for the fire insurance. We can voluntarily let their house burn down, and that that's the incentive system that they'll learn to pay the next time, or they'll learn to suffer the consequences. But fires spread to the next building and the next building, and you sometimes have consequences of not doing things that are just good for society, regardless of whether or not you're making money from it. Do you agree with, or do you at least understand that point? Do you at least recognize what I'm talking about?
I think I got at least part of what you're saying, and if I didn't get enough, you can fill me in again. But as it sounded like you were thinking that maybe there's a kind of altruistic motivation. You don't need something like the profit motive in order to generate new drugs, for example. People will still innovate even if they're not going to profit, but then you gave a sort of egoistic explanation, like you said, well, you just don't want people coughing on you. And that could be a reason you would still innovate, even if you're not reaping profit, you're reaping health, so to
Yeah,
speak, because
I'm not even talking about altruism. I am that my argument was mostly directed about selfishness. It is for reasons that it may not directly affect you right now to do something that helps the welfare, the well-being of other people. It may affect you down the road that you did that, because when people cough on you, then you're now you're in a bad situation. I I don't think that I don't know how many people would be motivated by altruism to do things without profit, but I do think that I mean I'm inspired by what you said before, which is that it would be in everybody's best interests to have something like this happen. It would be in the best interests of the people in the pharmaceutical companies, assuming that they don't go home to an island which is populated by nobody, for there to be a functional society around them which is able to thereby help them if they are in trouble. And the way in which they get to a functional society is that they do their part to be able to solve the problems of that society. And I understand people still needs to eat, but that is a motivation that would be strong in what I would consider to be a moral society to do, just for their own self-interests, just so that you know you the boss, if he lowers his wages and lowers his wages and lowers his wages, you don't have 10,000 people one day showing up with pitchforks at his house.
okay, well, there are degrees of motivation, and I think you could be motivated to a certain extent to innovate new drugs if you think by doing so you will help keep yourself healthy. But I think you could be motivated to a greater extent to innovate new drugs or anything if you thought that by doing so you could become a millionaire or become a billionaire, and then um, do all kinds of things like pursue some dream of sending people to Mars. Like if you're Elon Musk, you might have these very grand dreams. Maybe you want to buy a yacht and sail around the oceans,
Sure.
buy a mansion. I mean, there's all kinds of things you could do if you were rich, which you couldn't do if you were just maybe you're healthy, and if someone coughs on you, you have some medication that'll save you, but that's still a far cry from living a very wealthy lifestyle, which could be very enjoyable. So I think even if there is a motive to innovate, independent of being rich, there's a greater motivation to do more if people do have that profit motive that they can benefit from.
So okay, I do want to say one more thing, but we're about an hour in now. I want to pivot to a couple other things.
Okay.
So I'll maybe that'll come up in the course of other things. As I mentioned, I have 5 issues with capitalism, and I'm just going to name them quickly, and then we can discuss some of them. First of all, what I call externalities. The oil company sells oil for a profit, so they're doing fine. The consumer gives their money and comes home with oil. They're doing fine. The oil company, as a result of making that oil, drilling that oil, whatever, pours chemicals into the water supply of the neighborhood. Those people get sick. There is an external cost which is not being covered by the company or by the consumer. And I would argue that I would argue that neither of those parties are affected. The CEO of the oil company doesn't live in that neighborhood. I would argue that expecting for the people who have their water poisoned or their air poisoned or whatever to be able to win that case in court, if there's no agencies that can help them to determine the link between these things, what kind of lawyer is going to voluntarily work on that case? It could take years and years. to be able to do that. The people are getting sick. They're compromised in their ability to sustain themselves, which means that they're likely going to have less and less money coming in because they're too unhealthy to work at full capacity. They have to buy bottled water, you know. So externalities is a reason that I would want to have a government, and yes, say to the oil companies, you cannot pollute the water. I know, and even in the case of a ideal objectivist society, it seems like that way would be like, okay, well, later on, if those people get sick, they can sue in a court to try to reclaim some or all of the damages that were done to them, if that is even something that's possible. But the damage is already done. Theoretically, in the case of having a government there to regulate that from not happening, or saying, we're gonna put the CEO in prison. We're going to cause harm to your company, and if you don't do this, theoretically that prevents people from getting sick. Might not be the ideal perfect thing. Voluntarily, the oil company should say, okay, we're going to develop a system by which we don't pollute at all, but it's never happened. The second thing, I'll just go through them hopefully more quickly than that.
Okay.
Second thing is perverse incentives. The private prison industry is losing money if their beds are not fully stocked. That means that they have a vested interest in treating the prisoners as badly as possible, because psychologically, the worse people are treated, the more likely that they are to act out in general, and they want to have people who are acting out more because it means that they'll commit more crimes. They want to have sentences that are as long as possible so that they don't have to replace all those beds, and if they have to donate to a legislature, as you said, there would be a legislature, or to the private court that they are helping finance, for that court to say, we're gonna put more of these people into prison, then that is against what I believe to be the larger ideals of the society. So perverse incentives for not only, I don't know if you even believe in the idea of prisons, but or as a necessary thing, but any company that makes its money off of misery, and therefore is incentivized to cause as much misery as they can, so that their profit is increased at the expense of everybody else. The third thing is simpler. I don't think that a free market exists. I think that any system, you're not an anarchist, any system by which you have a market needs to have some sort of rules. Any rules needs to have some sort of enforcement mechanism. Any enforcers of the rules can be bribed by the people who have the most money. I think that's true of the court system. I think that's true of any way in the legislature, any way in which you're enforcing the rules as to how the market can operate. I think that a free market can maybe work in very, very small clusters where everyone perfectly trusts one another. But if you're dealing with people you don't know, and then the possibility of fraud and theft and all of these things come into play, and distrust, you have to have somebody, or else it's always my word against this other person's word. And so I don't think a free market really exists. I think it always devolves into who has the most money and who has the guns. And then the last thing I want to say, and I'm sure you'll have a diatribe of things. I'm sorry bringing all of these up at once, but I just want to make sure we get through them or mention them at least. Fourth thing is, I don't think that a meritocracy exists either. LeBron James, sports, I think, is much closer to a meritocracy than real life is. If you can play really well, you are very likely to be able to go to the to get paid the most and go to the top of the list. I don't see why Paris Hilton, who is an heiress, is famous and gets to essentially print whatever money she wants to print for having a life which is based on doing nothing, while people whose parents were not rich are working and working and working for a small fraction of the amount of money that she gets. I don't know if you can have a real competition in the market if there are certain entities that by inertia or by inheritance or by whatever have such gigantic advantages. Wyatt Koch is one of the sons or nephews or whatever of Charles and David Koch. He sells these t-shirts, or he sells these shirts that have dollar signs on them. There is no way that he would ever be able to make it in a marketplace where he was fairly competing. But of course, he makes a lot of money because of his name. He has a much better chance of selling 1,000 shirts in a day than someone who makes a superior shirt, but that nobody knows because he doesn't have an advertising budget. And so the amount of inertia that comes into a system is so great, I think, that the idea of a meritocracy has extremely limited value. And so when you're saying everyone should be able to fairly compete, that's a fine goal, but people aren't fairly competing. People are competing against giants that they have no realistic, real world way of being able to compete against because they don't have the advertising, they don't have the name, they don't have the convenience, they don't have the mobility to have their stuff made in a third world country and shipped for less money, and sold for less money. And that capitalism doesn't distinguish. Capitalism very easily morphs into, well, if I can pay the legislators a little bit of money to rig the rules in my favor, that is easier than me paying for research and development to a better product. I'm trying to make a profit. I'm going to put my money towards doing that. And it always turns into the corrupt thing that we have now, in my view. I'll let you talk for as long as you'd like.
Okay. That was only 4. Was there? I thought there was 5.
The fifth one is about winners and losers, which we did.
Oh, okay.
About. I just sort of I see, you can make the LeBron James argument. I see that the number of athletes and sports is imperfect for this sort of thing. The amount of athletes that try out for the NBA or other professional leagues around the world, and the amount that make it into the league to even play 10 minutes of their lives is less than 1% of them. I look at musicians and I know that there are thousands of successful musicians, but I know that there are millions of musicians that don't make any money at all. I think that capitalism by its nature produces a much smaller amount of quote unquote winners. And I'm sure that it produces, some amount of people that are okay, I'm a little better off than I would have been if I had not sold this product, and I'm eking out a living and I'm fine. But there's, I think, a relative ton of people that try and just don't. The marketplace is not accepting of them, or again, the marketplace just never hears about them. And so I am concerned in terms of morality as to what should happen to the losers. Um, the I think that morality is less about everybody has the same theoretical rights, because you can say, well, the person who's not blind and the person who is blind both have the right to be able to see the sunset. In reality, only one of them can. I think morality is about the fact that I have no problem with corporations making money, or forget about corporations. Corporations gets into government involvement. I have no problem with companies making money. I think a moral society protects the people that need the help the most. And even if that means taking it from the people who don't need it, I look at the Koch brothers. They had $80 billion between the two of them. David has passed away. They had $80 billion between the two of them. What did they spend their lives on at age 90? Not sailing around the world, not lavishing in the riches. Charles Koch still spends his money trying to get regulations taken off of his company so that he can put more sludge into the water. He still bribes politicians, donates to politicians, which are really bribes, in order to get tax cuts. He can't spend this money, the amount of money he has. His kids can't spend his money. 10 generations of his kids can't spend his money. He's just hoarding it for the sake of hoarding it. And I guess that's his right to do that. But it is not this thing of oh, well, there'll be a benevolent thing in which people will spread it around. It's the fact in which there are so many people, in my view, that are struggling, that for me the moral thing to do is to help those people, even if it means that Charles Koch has to cry himself to sleep with only $10 billion instead of 80. And even if that means that at the point of a gun, he has to do that. That's just my personal belief.
Okay. All right. Now I get my 10 or 15-minute diatribe.
As much as you want. I apologize for how long that was.
No, that's all right. That's all right. So first point was externalities. I think the key to addressing that, I've heard people, objectivists, say that's not even a legitimate concept, externalities. I don't know if I want to go into why that is, maybe partly because it's not fully clear in my own mind, but what I think is clear enough to me is that we need to define rights clearly. So you give this example of dumping industrial waste into a river that's going to that's going to harm other people, third parties.
Sure.
So I think what needs to happen is you define rights to the water, and if you pollute somebody else's water, so you don't have, I think it's called the tragedy of the commons. Like if you have something that's not owned by anyone in particular, then it gets polluted, or bad things happen to it. But if someone's got an interest in the property, including in the water, then they have an interest in protecting that. And you can take somebody to court, sue them. And so there's a mechanism to deal with, to protect third parties. Now there's no magic law or regulation that's going to avoid this. Like, even if you had the governments saying that you're not allowed to pollute in the water, I mean, people could still do that, even if there is a law or a regulation on the books that says you can't, just as much as people could violate someone else's property rights. So whether you say somebody has a property right in the water, which you're not allowed to violate by dumping waste into it, or if someone doesn't have a property right in the water, but you just have a government issuing a regulation that says you're not allowed to dump waste into the water, well, either way, people could violate that regulation and do it anyways. And then I guess in the one case, you're going to be taken to court. In the other case, you'll be taken to court by the third party who has a right in that water. In the other case, I guess you could be taken to court by the government, but maybe it's better, at least for the following reason, to have the third party do it rather than the government take you to court, because they have an interest. I mean, well, what does the government care? I mean, if they're not really benefiting from that water rights, then maybe they have a less of an incentive to take care of it. Whereas the private property owner who does have a right in that water, they really do have an incentive to take good care of it. So maybe they'll more likely be active in pursuing people who try to dump waste into that water.
Okay, so
Wait. You had like 15 minutes.
no. I just want to.
This got to be super short.
When you just let me know when you're about to move on to the second point, because I have to.
I was just about to do that.
Against that, but okay. Do you want to cover these one by one, or do you want to go through all?
I want to go through all five because you did all five.
Totally fine. Just
all
one.
Right. All right. So let me go into the second point, which was perverse incentives. So private prisons. Okay. So this is something I haven't I thought about much. So I don't even know if you said you didn't know if I do believe in prisons. Yeah, I think I have nothing against there being prisons. I think there should be such things. Now, there's a question as to who should run them. Should they be government institutions or should they be private? Now, since they involve force or coercion, you're coercively restricting people's freedom of movements. Maybe they should be operated by the government, because I think that's the province of the government. It's to be the sole. They have a monopoly on the use of force, the legal use of force, and I guess that it could include forcing people to stay within a certain area if they violated some crime. So I don't know that there should be private prisons. This is just something I haven't thought much about or heard discussed by people who support capitalism. So now, but if there are private prisons, which I'm not sure there should be, but if there are, then there is an issue of reputation. So if you have people who are doing things like that, they want people to act badly and maybe violate the rules of the prison, so they have to stay in longer so that they can make more money off of them. Well, I think you could get a bad reputation for doing this. If you get a reputation as a psychopath, then maybe people who fund you, I don't know how they are getting the money to run these prisons, but however they're getting money, that source of money might dry up or diminish because they are doing bad things, like just trying to keep people in for longer without any good reason. So they have reputational harm to suffer if they act irrationally. All right, I'm going to go on to the third point, which is, you said you don't think free markets exist because you need rules, or I guess I'll just add laws. I do think there should be laws, but that doesn't mean free markets don't exist. I think you need laws to have free markets. Like if you just have a state of anarchy, I don't think that's a free market. And this is one way in which I distinguish myself from the libertarians. They're often anti-state, not just anti-statism, where you have a big, powerful government that's coercing people, but they don't want any government at all, just a state of lawlessness, at least many libertarians. So I don't support anarchy. I do think there should be laws and rules, which the basic principle of which is that people cannot initiate force against each other. And once you have that system in place, then you have a free market where people can compete with each other, not on the grounds of coercion, but on the grounds of persuasion. You can try to persuade people to buy your product or to do business with you, but you can't force them to. You can't put a gun to their heads and make them buy your product. As for bribery, that can exist in any system, whether you have the governments regulating. Actually, I think maybe it's not a feature of capitalism that you have where you have bribery. It's when you have when you give government officials the power to regulate, then you get lobbyists coming in to lobby the regulators. So when you give, like, I think this happened in the railroad industry in the 19th century. You had the government giving out subsidies to build railroads, and then you had people lobbying the government, trying to get subsidies for their railroads. But if you don't have a dispenser of favors, if the government cannot dispense special favors, special subsidies, then you don't have any people trying to bribe the government. There's nothing to bribe them to do. I guess even if you had even if you didn't have regulators, there still might be some people who try to bribe. But I mean, that can happen in any system. But I think you incentivize the bribery will increase if you do give government officials the power to regulate the economy. Whereas, if they don't have the power, then people can't go running to the government and try to get special favors from it. All right. Point number 4, you said you don't think meritocracy exists, and you cited things like inherited wealth, Paris Hilton, and this heir of the Koch brothers who's making t-shirts. So there's certainly going to be some inherited wealth, but I don't think that means that there's not also a rising to the top of people who do have ability. There's this saying that was common, I think, in the 19th century: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, which means you might start off poor, like if you're Carnegie, and then you have this rags to riches story. He rises, and then by the 3rd generation, he gives all his wealth away to his I don't know if in his case, but you might become some super rich industrialist, and then he might have heirs, and then they're worthless heirs. They fritter away their money. They're playboys. And then by the 3rd generation, or maybe the 4th generation, you're back to shirt sleeves. So from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Apparently this was a common thing, so much so that it became a common saying in the 19th century. So yes, there's, at least temporarily in some cases, there are going to be people who benefit from inherited wealth, but I don't think it's going to perpetuate inevitable or perpetually, indefinitely into the future. And if it does, I think people have to be equal to the wealth. They have to be worthy of it. There's a certain character in Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's novel, who inherits a lot of wealth, but I don't want to give away the plot, but anyways, if you're interested in this idea of inherited wealth, there's an interesting plot or element of the plot in Atlas Shrugged that deals with a certain character who inherits a lot of wealth, and I invite people to check that out. But I don't think people have a right to be equal. And you mentioned before, you don't think that there is anyone calling for equality, like everyone has to have the same level of wealth or income. But there is a lot of complaining about inequality. And I think we need to concretize, what exactly does that mean? Are we allowed to be unequal within a certain range? Like, I can have 1 order of magnitude wealth more than you, but not 2, or, where do we draw the line, and how is it not arbitrary? I think what the best sort of system is not to worry about that sort of thing, and rather protect people's rights. Again, I said equality before the law, where you're not coercing anyone. Everyone is equal in that sense. No one is being coerced. I don't think people have a right to a certain standard of living. Or a certain line of work. Like, maybe my dream when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pro soccer player. That was my first career passion. And after a few years, I got less interested in soccer. I was more interested in basketball. And then for a few years, basketball was my career passion. I wanted to go to the NBA when I grew up. And so I played in the Little League basketball team in high school. I played on the varsity squad for a few years, but I wasn't good enough to make it the pros by a long shot. But I don't have any right to make my living as a pro basketball player. No one owes that to me. I have to compete on the free market. And if I'm good enough to do that, fine. If I'm not, well, then I have to look for something else. But you mentioned, there's only thousands of people who try out, but millions of people who are musicians or athletes. Okay, sure. But I don't think anyone owes them a living in a certain way. They have to find what their skills can earn them on the market and make a living that way. So both in terms of the kind of profession someone has, and then the amount of wealth the standard of living they earn in whatever profession. I don't think anyone has a right to a certain standard of living. What they have a right to do, or a certain profession, what they have a right to do is take the actions that are required to support themselves, and no one can interfere with that. So if I can't make it as a pro athlete or a pro musician, but I can make it as a dentist or as a computer programmer, no one can forcibly stop me from doing that, or forcibly take away the wealth that I can earn doing that. Like they can't take away part of my paycheck to go to Social Security if I don't want it to go to that, or to go to Medicare if I don't want it to go to that and support others. I can support myself in some way, and I have a right to everything I can earn in that way. And then to the last point, winners and losers, which you said we actually discussed at the beginning, so maybe I won't go into that as much. Oh, but you did bring up the issue of morality, which that might segue into another part of the discussion. You think that the moral system is the one that helps those who need it most, even if it means Charles Koch doesn't get to keep $80 billion and he only gets to keep $10 billion, and even if we have to enforce that at gunpoint. So that might be good to talk about. I certainly don't think it's good to enforce to take people's things away about at gunpoint. And there's an arbitrariness to it. I don't think there's really any principled way to draw the line as to why 10 billion rather than 80 billion. Why not 100,000 instead of 10 billion. There's no way to draw the line. I think the only principled way to draw the line is people have to deal with each other as animals by brute force, law of the jungle, or they can deal with each other as rational beings. And that means by using persuasion, not coercion, by respecting each other's freedom, their mind, their choice to act as they will. So we can talk more about that, but I think I will pause there and turn it back to you.
Okay. So it may have been a mistake for me to bring up everything at once, because we've just 10 different directions. I want to ask just a couple of simple questions, and then I'll go into some of the things that you said. You gave a percentage of the people that you believe are actually struggling to the point at which they are not able to care for themselves. Do you have any sort of percentage in your mind as to what amount of people you consider to be rational? And the reason I ask that is because I do not see government, no government, have not unrelated, irrespective of that. I see gambling, I see speeding, I see overeating, I see tons of things that people do which are not in their best self-interest all the time. And I see things, that the person who goes and gambles one night, maybe the next day they go to work and they have a very productive, normal, rational day of earning for their family. But I see aspects of irrationality everywhere, and the concept of relying upon everybody to be rational in a society which, quote unquote, should work because of the rationality of everybody seems odd to me. But I just want to get your thoughts on that very small point.
Okay. So people vary in their rationality, both from one person to another, but also within a given person's life. I can be more rational or less rational depending on the way I choose to act. So I think rationality is a choice. If we choose to use our minds to the best of our ability to follow reason rather than just worshiping our emotions. Whim worshiping is a term Ayn Rand sometimes uses. It's a choice open to everyone of how rational to be. Rationality is not the same thing as intelligence. I think you can be 100% rational. That doesn't mean you're going to be as smart as Einstein.
Sure.
But whatever intelligence you have, you can make the most of it, or you cannot make the most of it. You can try to be as rational as you can, or you can just give into the blind impulses of the moment. And some people do that sometimes, like you mentioned, gambling. Maybe somebody gambles compulsively, and they fritter away their money and they end up poor as a result. But that's a choice. And I think everyone has, short of having literal brain damage, everyone has the ability to live a rational life. In virtually everyone, I think 99.99999, I don't know what it is, super high percentage of people can support themselves by using their rational mind, and it's just up to them, up to their own choice to do it or not.
Okay. A couple of quick things that I want to um that I want to suggest to point out in a couple of the things you said. I don't have a. Oh, I mean, it's you can't have everything. I don't have a major problem with certain things being arbitrarily decided. That's what legislatures do all the time. They decide. That's what we. Most of the things. Why do we have our border with Canada? We arbitrarily, there's no line in the dirt that says this is where the United States ends and where Canada begins. We arbitrarily at some point in our history determined that that's where the country ends. Why do why are taxes right now 21%? Why aren't they 22% or 19% or whatever? We arbitrarily determine that. I if somebody were to make a crunch all the numbers and say that the most that a person can reasonably spend in a lifetime is $2.7 billion, then I would have no problem with using that and saying that's the empirical amount that we've come up with, because we're all doing our best, and you're never going to have a perfect system by which everybody gets everything and 100% freedom and 100% security and 100% of everything. We have to have some rules. Almost every regulation and almost every law is based on you can do this thing which goes up to the line of being inappropriate, but you can't do this thing which goes slightly over the line of being inappropriate. I don't know that there's I don't know that there's anything better than that. Obviously, if it's arbitrary and it's egregious, then yeah, I'm against it. If it's something that makes no sense or that a vast majority of the people are against, then I wouldn't agree with it. But yeah, I would draw the line wherever people who have studied this issue think it is best to draw the line. And then it comes to, you say, well, bribery is, bribery can happen in any system. Yes, it can happen in any system, but your capitalist system has courts. Your capitalist system has police, has a legislature. Your objectivist system. All of those people are subject to being bribed, where or subject, even if you don't necessarily even want to call it a bribe, or subject to just being overwhelmed by money. If 80% of the police funding is coming from 5 people, and 1,000 people are funding the other 20% of the police force, the police are gonna, who are they going to listen to when push comes to shove and there's a dispute between one of those 5 people and one of the 1,000 people? The people that are giving them almost no money or a tiny bit of money, or the people that are giving them 80% of their money? That water supply, the tragedy of the commons, that the water supply is owned by nobody. Well, the people in the neighborhood can put up and say, okay, well, we'd like to, we're gonna put up $10,000 between us to try to buy that water supply so that now it's ours and you can't pollute it. And the oil company is going to say, I'm going to put up $5 million. They have all the money. Why are they not just going to buy that water supply? And then the people around there, do they have to move? Do they have to move to another place? What if that place builds an oil company right next to it? They have to keep moving? There is no solution to having people that have so much wealth that they can buy whatever mechanism determines the things that make these differences and determine those lives. and the one other thing which is related to that, and I'm not going to bring up perverse incentives for right now. I'll bring up the other thing, but the one other thing is, yeah, the government says that you can't pollute the water, and yes, some people may violate that, but then there are consequences for doing so. The consequences for doing so, if the government has said you can't do it, is that you're going to be hit with um, heavy penalties before it happens. If we're talking about a world of incentives, you may be incentivized to say, I better not do this. Just like you might be incentivized to say, there's a law that says I can't steal from my neighbor's house. I am going to be incentivized because I don't want to face the consequences of breaking that law. So I'm going to be deterred from doing that. Saying, okay, well, I already did break into their house. I already stole their things, and then because I was in their house and the dog was attacking me, I had to kill their dog. Now maybe they will sue me for damages. The damage is already done. The deterrent effect of having it be a law which disallows it is not in effect, because all of the things that can happen to that oil company are things that are after the fact. It doesn't prevent the actual catastrophe. It just mitigates it later. And I think that is a much stronger incentivizing deterrent to people doing bad acts if they know that there's a severe punishment. And frankly, that the government, who has the guns — the reason I brought up the guns is because at the end of the day, as any objectivist I'm sure would argue, if you don't pay your taxes, somebody with a gun eventually comes to your house. The people with the guns seem like they are a somewhat bigger incentivizing force away from doing things than the poor people that are living in a neighborhood that don't have any resources.
Okay. Several points there.
Sure.
So we started with the point about arbitrariness. So certain things are arbitrary, but within limits, I think. Like the age of adulthood, I think that was one example that came to mind. Like, should it be 18? Some countries it's 21, sometimes it's 16, right? There are different ages, but it's not 5, right? There are certain ages which are clearly outside the limit.
As I said, I don't want something arbitrary that nobody agrees with and that is egregiously out of bounds. Just bounds of reason.
Yeah. So
Charles Koch having $10 billion is still quite a reason.
So I don't consider 10 billion or 100 billion unreasonable. So how are we going to decide what is egregious, what is out of bounds? I think what we need is a principle, and or I think one way to decide what is out of bounds is a principle such as coercion versus voluntariness. So whatever you can earn by voluntary means without using force, that's what you have a right to. Draw the line that way rather than in terms of some number. I don't think there is I think the principle of coercion versus voluntariness is a non-arbitrary distinction. I think that gets to the heart of I think it's a fundamental issue of political philosophy. How should people interact with each other? Should they interact with each other in a voluntary way, or should you, when something isn't the way you like, go, take out a club or a gun and go bash the other person's skull in, or hold them up at gunpoint? I think that's a principled distinction, whereas I don't think there's a principled. In other words, I don't think there's a distinction that gets at the essentials of how people interact with each other that you can draw in terms of a certain level of wealth. That I think is arbitrary. If there were only an arbitrary way to draw the line, then we have to go with something. But I don't think there is only an arbitrary place to draw the line. I think it's a non-arbitrary distinction to go by coercion versus persuasion, reason versus force. And we can talk more about that, but I do think that is a non-arbitrary way to organize society around that sort of distinction.
Okay.
All right. Next point you made. was about bribery. Um, you said, yes, it can happen in any system. Um, but I think there's also, well, I already made the point about, I think you incentivize bribery when you give the government more power, because now you have these people, these regulators, which you can try to bribe to get regulations that favor you rather than your competitors. But if you have the system set up such that those kinds of regulations don't exist, and then what's going to happen is if you accept a bribe or offer yourself, if you prostitute yourself, you're going to have to do this in the shadows, so to speak. You're going to have to do it under the table. You can't do it out in the open, or at least not as much. It's going to be harder because it violates the very essence of the system. It's written into the Constitution or into the laws of the sort of system I advocate that you cannot give special favors. You cannot have coercive power over the economy if you're a government official. And if you do this, then you're breaking the law. You can be thrown in jail, or I don't know exactly what the penalty will be. You'll certainly suffer reputational damage if you try to offer bribes to companies. So there are incentives that would, I think, cut against, mitigate the bribery and the sort of system I advocate. That might make it harder for bribery to happen. And we can talk about that more if you want. Eminent domain was one other thing that came to mind. You were saying, like, well, what's going to happen if you have some rich people, a rich oil company who wants to pollute the water, and then you've got these other people who don't have as much money. Well, it's too bad. If you have property rights defined and let's say you're a poor landowner, but you have certain rights to the water that say no one else can pollute it, it doesn't matter that some other company wants to pollute it. Now, today, we have a system where something like eminent domain.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last thing? I thought when you were saying it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter that someone else has more money than you.
How would you actually how would the neighborhood acquire the rights to the water if there's any kind of bidding war for the water? If it's not owned right now, how would it be the case in which the neighborhood would end up with the water?
So you're talking about original acquisition, not assuming that someone already has. Well, let me just finish up the case where it's not original acquisition. Let's just stipulate that some poor landowner has rights to some water, and then some rich oil company wants to come in and take his rights away. He can't just do that. Now, today, I think there is something called eminent domain, which I think Trump has tried to use, which allows some people, rich people, to say, well, it's in the public interest for me to take over this land, even though someone else has a right to it. And then the government will do that. I don't think that's right. So just because you're rich doesn't mean you can take over someone's property rights. But now, if we're talking about the case you were asking, like, if there's a bidding war, I guess, certainly you have leverage, more leverage if you're richer and there's a bidding war. But who has the right to create this bidding war? Like, who is offering it for sale? Are we talking, like, I'm thinking about the in back in the 19th century, the Homestead Act, where there was basically the unowned West.
Right.
And the government said, I think it was basically like a first come, first serve. Like, if you move out there and you work the land for a certain amount of time, then you get a deed, or you get ownership over the lands. Can you hold on a second? It's starting to rain where I am, and I'm getting rained on. So I need to grab an umbrella so that my laptop doesn't get wet. Hold on a minute.
All right.
Yeah.
So
it is still recording.
Sure. Because it's raining, we'll just go for another few minutes and then we'll call it, because it's silliness to keep going. We've been on for 2 hours.
All right. Yeah, we can wrap it up. Um,
I want to
so,
spend
yeah, go
a few
ahead.
more minutes on a couple of things, but yeah, within the next 10 or so minutes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. What was the last thing?
You
What
were
was the
talking
last thing I was
about
saying?
you were talking about
Oh, I remember now.
Act and original acquisition of the land.
Yeah. So, I don't know if if there might be cases where you're you're at an advantage if you're richer in terms of acquiring original possession of something. Uh, but I don't know if that's, I'm not sure how relevant that is. This might be a case where just like not everyone has a right to a certain standard of living or a certain line of work. Likewise, it might be the case that just not everyone has a right to get original acquisition to something. Um, but I haven't thought this through very much, so
If they
I'm not
don't
sure.
have original acquisition to it, then they're, I mean, basically you're saying don't move into that neighborhood because the water supply is poison because the oil company is going to do anything that they want to with it. And if it, okay, maybe that's just the water, but okay, what if it's the air? Everyone breathes the air. There's no right to that. Everyone breathes the air. There's going to be chemical particles in the air. The oil company is going to choose a neighborhood that has the fewest resources to be able to inhibit their ability to pollute the air. They have the resources to be able to choose that neighborhood so that they get the least pushback. And that's not a rights issue unless you can think of a way in which that would be a rights issue.
So if it's original acquisition of a neighborhood, I mean, I don't think that everyone should have an equal right to get a get access to that neighborhood. I mean, you should be able to live somewhere, but a particular place, I don't think anyone should necessarily have a equal rights to get access to some particular place. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what more to say about that right now.
All right. So, in the interest of time, I want to
Mhm.
ask you one question, and then
Yeah.
one more example, and then we have you respond, and we go. Um,
Okay.
so, I don't know exactly how much uh, intervention there was by the government during the Jim Crow era in the South. That's just an example. There were certainly cases that you could see that may or may not fall under that exact category, where you have a town or a community that is prejudiced against certain people. You may even you have that today, even though it's not necessarily based on race. Um, you have certain businesses. Let's say that somebody spreads a rumor that someone in a marketplace is has sex with children. They say no, I don't, and you can't provide any evidence of this, but they say, yeah, I mean, if you let me onto your property, I'll provide the evidence. And he said, it says if you might plant the stuff on my property, so that suggests that there's evidence. Everybody believes the things that you say, whatever. The entire marketplace might be completely fine, or if that's an extreme example, somebody who's Muslim, the entire community might be like, yeah, I I don't want to sell to you. I don't like your religion. I don't think your religion is compatible with my religion. You're Chinese, and I think that the Chinese Communist Party is an evil on our land. I don't want to do business with you. Um, that is not the people are not going to suffer reputational damage the private prison is not going to suffer reputational damage for arresting a bunch of Muslims in that community and treating them terribly. People are going to make their own assumptions as to, well, you know, this this prison is a, you know, has a business to this prison is, you know, has some has some responsibility to keep us safe, so they must know what they're doing, and that must mean, you know, the people who did something must have committed some kind of crime, and then I don't care what happens to them. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I'm living my own life. What would you do or say about any sort of marketplace where there's inherent discrimination among the people, which would prevent certain members of the marketplace from being able to compete fairly through no fault of their own?
Well, I do think there are market mechanisms that disincentivize irrational behavior, such as racism or sexism. So if you you run a restaurant and you say, I'm not going to serve black people because you're racist, then you're going to lose all the black customers, and even you're going to lose customers of non-black people who don't like you because you're a racist and they don't want to support you.
Can I can I push back?
Yeah, sure.
What about what happens if you offset the amount of people, black people, you would lose, and that black people aren't that many people in the community, with other racists that are championing the fact that you did this? Chick-fil-A became more popular after there was a boycott from gay rights activists, because of the fact that a lot of right wingers were like, yeah, no, we have to support this company more. I'm going to go to Chick-fil-A even harder and eat even, you know, even more of their food because of the stance that they took. What happens if there is no reputational damage, or if the reputation of somebody even grows because of their racism or sexism?
Well, it might simultaneously grow and shrink. Like you get more of a certain audience, but you're going to get less of another. And maybe on nets, you'll grow, at least in the short term.
Yeah,
But you're losing other people who don't like your anti-gay stance, for example, if you're Chick-fil-A. But I mean, there's people have a right to have irrational policies, and I'm not saying in this case it's necessarily irrational. I leave that to the viewer to decide.
But it sounds as though you are saying that the market supports discrimination as long as the discrimination happens to net more people than it loses.
No, it supports, it incentivizes rationality and disincentivizes irrationality. And that's not to say that if you're irrational, you can never grow. But I think in the long run, the forces push against irrational policies and in favor of rational ones.
But if you are of the belief, and again, I also will let the audience decide, if you are of the belief that rational people do not discriminate against other people on the basis of their skin color, sexual orientation, or whatever, and discriminate is a loaded word, they do not treat people in a more or less whatever, they don't, if you believe that that is an irrational way for someone to think, the irrationality is not hindered if there are more irrational people that believe the same thing as the business owner does, and that nets them more profit than the supposedly rational idea of treating everybody with the, you know, colorblind mentality. Isn't it the case? And maybe this is not a problem of the free market. Maybe there's a problem of all humanity. But isn't it the case in which if you have a society which holds similar bigotries to that owner, and there's no mechanism because the profit motive would favor the owner going along with the crowd of bigotry and making more money because they're going to get more customers than they lose, isn't that an incentive? It doesn't is there, there's no countervailing thing that is going to protect the minority in that community.
I think there still is, but I think we have to take a longer run view of it, or maybe a larger context view of it. So, for example, um, if you cultivate a customer base that is irrational, then I think your customers are not going to be as wealthy. Like I'm not going to want to associate with or employ these sorts of people who are your customers because they're racist. So like if they let it known that they're racist, then I'm going to want to have less to do with them because I think they're irrational, which is going to make it harder for them to earn money to then spend at your restaurant. So if we trace out the consequences of the irrationality, I think we'll see that in the long run, it actually does harm them, even if there's a short-term boost. Like, I don't think irrationality is self-sustaining. I think it's a self-defeating sort of policy, but sometimes it takes a while to work itself out.
So you don't think that there have been many generations, for example, of banks engaging in redlining against against
Mhm.
minorities? That is, you can say, well, 80 years from now, the attitudes are going to change, and that's going to hurt my great grandchildren after I'm long dead. But there was no, and you could also say, this wasn't my perfect objectivist system, but there was no pushback against that kind of thing for generations. There was no consequence to be paid for doing that. In fact, it was regarded as a standard way of doing business. And then, yeah, I'll just leave it. I'll just leave it at that. It was not regarded as something that oh, we're going to lose customers by doing this. It was regarded as, well, we have deemed these people sight unseen to be riskier, and so we're just going to discriminate against them based upon our own conception of things. And it didn't that did not slow down the growth of the banks in any way, as far as I can tell.
Well, I know almost nothing about redlining in its history, but if if the banks were not making loans to certain communities because they deemed those loans riskier, they're less likely to get their money back, regardless of race. Um, then I don't know that that was irrational of them. I mean, if they're just making a financial calculation that based on patterns we've seen, people in this area, for whatever reason, are more risky investments, then we're gonna not invest in these places. I mean, if that's why they were doing that, I'm I'm reluctant to say they were being irrational. Now, maybe something else was going on.
I mean, it's the rationality. We're bridging two different things, because there's can be rationality from a fiscal business sense and rationality of the way of treating people that you haven't met with, with uh, some summary contempt for the way that other people that look like them. It's just, rationality is, it can be defined in multiple ways. All right, I'll I think I can I can accept that answer. I want to give my one other question or example, and then we can go.
Okay.
And that is Walmart. Walmart, um, as far as I can see, and yeah, it's not only Walmart. There are other companies that emulate this. I'm just going to use Walmart as an example. Um, if you're a if you're someone that sells rugs, like a small business sells rugs in a town, your rugs might be of very good quality, but Walmart is now selling rugs. Walmart comes into your town. They're gigantic. They offer rugs. Now, the rugs are maybe of 20%, 25% lower quality than your rugs are, but they're selling them at half price, half of the price that you're charging, because they're able to get their rugs made in Honduras, and you are not. You don't have the resources to have that mobility. And you can say, well, my rugs are a little bit better, and they are, but customers are going to Walmart for everything. So they're going and they're saying, okay, I'm gonna go buy food, and I'm gonna go buy a dog dish, and I'm going to buy a lampshade, and I'm going to buy, and here's a rug. I'm going by the rug aisle. I'm not going to drive 6 miles out of my way to go to the rug store that sells slightly better rugs, because it's much more convenient and it's cheaper for me to get this rug at Walmart. Now, normally you would say, okay, well, that person doesn't have a God-given right to, or whatever given right to sell rugs. They should compete in something else if they don't have, because the rug store, which was thriving for a while, now is not able to compete because no one is buying the rugs anymore. Walmart is paying their employees a lower wage than you are paying, but you can't sustain that because you don't have enough money coming in to your store. So you can't employ the people that you were employing anymore. You can employ them for less and less money, but maybe there's nobody in town that's interested in taking a job for $2 an hour. They have a family. They need more money than that. They need to find some other option. So Walmart comes in and essentially puts that business out of business, because they just can't compete anymore. Now you can say, okay, well, they can go and learn a different skill, or they can go and do something else. Well, maybe they also have a skill of, like, I can make really nice plates. Okay, so instead of a rug store, now I'm a plate store. Problem is Walmart sells plates. Walmart has the same exact problem. So are they going to spend all of the time and money to learn a skill to, like, okay, well, now I'm going to become like now I'm going to go and sell chairs? Walmart sells chairs. Are they going to move out into another market, move 2 towns over? Well, maybe there's a Walmart there. Maybe 6 months from now there'll be a Walmart there. They're gonna face the same problem every single time. The government didn't have anything to do with force. There was no force involved. Walmart just came in. The market decided that it put half of the businesses in town, because Walmart sells everything. So it's going to impact not only the rug place, but the cosmetics place and everything. It is a perverse incentive, in my view, to have a company that, just because they can, take so much of the business away from so many other people. And then because and the reason I think it's a perverse incentive is the people aren't getting better rugs. They're getting, by definition of the question, worse rugs. 20% worse rugs from Walmart. They aren't getting more competition. They're getting less competition because all the businesses have closed. They aren't getting higher wages. They're getting lower wages because Walmart is able to have kind of a near monopoly on where people can work, because all the other businesses are closed. What would you do in a situation, or how is it a good outcome that Walmart, just because it sells, and you can say the Waltons are great capitalists, they invented this store that sells everything, and it's so convenient, and the prices are so low. And that may be true, but there's all of these other things that come along to hurt the society when that happens, of the things I mentioned and other things, and other things. Walmart then is able, because they make so much money, to out advertise everybody else. They're also able to pour as much money as they need into the court system, so that no one can sue them. Again, someone still can sue them, but if Walmart is donating 90% of the money to the private court, then who's the private court going to listen to? Who are they going to side with? Who is the prison going to side with? Who is the legislature going to side with? Walmart is the only entity that has all the money that's keeping these people in business. The roads, why would Walmart build a road to anyone else's business? They're going to build a road that goes straight to Walmart. In this sort of situation, do you see how capitalism can end up being a system which cannibalizes itself and ends up in a worse outcome because power is too consolidated at the top? And that's my last question.
Okay. I don't think it's going to have the sort of negative effects that you think it's going to have, and this might have to do with the broken window fallacy again. So, like, all the money that somebody saves by being able to buy these cheap goods at Walmart, now they have more money that they can put into something else. They can now buy more expensive things elsewhere. They're different. Like, you can have McDonald's restaurants, and then you can have 5-star restaurants that cater to richer clientele. And just because you have cheap rugs, cheap chairs, cheap lampshades at Walmart doesn't mean there's not going to be a market for, higher end goods as well. And because you can save so much on certain goods by shopping at Walmart, that means you have more money to spend on higher end goods elsewhere. So I think there might be a bit of the broken window thing going on. If we look at all the consequences, we'll see that it doesn't mean Walmart is going to come to own everything. As for, you mentioned private courts are another aspect of the governments. So there's basically three functions that Ayn Rand mentions: the police, the military, and the courts. Those are the three government functions. There will be some other things like a legislature, but to keep it simple, I'll just mention those three. So I don't think there's going to be a private court that's going to be
Sorry about that.
that's going to be one of the functions of the government. And I mean, there's still the issue of bribery, but again, that applies to any system. So
sorry to interrupt, but the issue of general funding, you believe in voluntarily funding these organizations.
Right.
What is the difference between them being private because they are being funded by a few private entities and them being the government? The reason that the government is the government right now is that the public is forced to pay taxes to fund these things, and that's why we elect people rather than, that's why we elect people into these offices, to be general representatives of the people's will, or at least in theory. What is if the courts are being voluntarily funded and 80% of the funding is coming from 12 people, then even though you can say, well, they're not officially private, those 12 people rationally have just as much of an incentive, if not more, to say every court decision is going to agree with us or else we're not going to fund them, than as to say, I want to have a court system that works for everybody in the society, even if it means we lose a whole bunch of money because the court rules against us. At some point, maybe that happens once, and then the next people are like, yeah, we're not doing that again. We're definitely going to have the case in which the court's going to rule in favor of us, or we're not going to have that court.
Okay. So again, there's the issue of reputational damage. I mean, if you're trying to pull these shenanigans, I think you do so at great risk to yourself. I mean, if it gets so bad, there's just so much corruption and bribery, then I guess it could be time for a revolution, overthrow the governments. As happens in the American Revolution, they thought there was just so much authoritarianism and bad acting on the part of the British government that it was time to overthrow it. So likewise, if you have a capitalist system and then you find out that there's all this corruption, then you could start a revolution.
So wait a second. So let's say that 60% of the population believes that it has come time for a revolution because there's too much corruption. 40% of the populace is in favor of the legislature and the government system that is happening. You never have 100% of the people that all get together and push the same button and say we've reached tyranny, we must have a revolution. It's always some sort of contingent. Wouldn't that be some people using force to take away the system that some people rightfully elected? I mean, what if it's
Right. Well, you can't. I don't think you can.
revolution, but what if it's 15% of people who want a revolution, but have big private, security forces, and they want to have a revolution against the government, and 85% of the people say no, we don't want this, but the 15% are like, we have all the power, we have the men, we have the guns, we have whatever. You're not either you're gonna fight for the government and we're gonna kill you, or you're just going to stand by and we're going to do this. Isn't that using force in the other direction? Force to take away the things that have been voluntarily chosen, the system that's been voluntarily chosen by the rest of the society.
So I think what justifies a revolution is if it's in the name of freedom, which the way I define freedom is the absence of coercion. So if you have, and it doesn't matter what the percentages are. So it's not like if 60% of the population is okay with enslaving the other 40%,
right, then
because they're a majority, they can go ahead and do their enslavements. Or so the percentages are not relevant here. Is the government acting in a way that curtails, violates people's freedom, which means coercing them? And if you launch a revolution in the name of the principle of protecting people from coercion, then it's legitimate. Otherwise, it's not.
Okay, that may be true, but who makes that decision? You, in your belief, some people felt that Obamacare was a slightly different way in which we fund poor people and subsidize them to give them some level of health care. Some people saw Obamacare as the government in a vicious takeover of the healthcare economy and, one step away from rolling the tanks down the street. Who, if you were to decide, I think that this is an illegitimate government because they have used force in this thing, and I were to say, nah, I don't think this is an illegitimate government, I think that they have a perfect right to do that. Who makes that decision? Because a revolution means we are necessarily forcefully making a change that one of us doesn't want.
Yeah,
I don't have
right.
I don't have the right to snap my fingers and stop your revolution if you have all the guns. I can't voluntarily say no, I'd like to still live under the government if the government is being toppled.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I think there is an issue of just judgment, and not everyone is going to agree. When is it appropriate for a revolution to happen? Like in the American Revolution, should they have waited for it to get a little bit worse until they had their revolution, or should they have done it a little bit sooner? Did they do it at exactly the right time? We can haggle over these details, but I think the more important thing is to understand the principles of political philosophy, and that's what I'm trying to do mostly in the kind of activism. I'm trying to argue that a good system is a one in which people deal with each other in a voluntary way and don't coerce each other. If I can sell people on that, I'm not as concerned on when is exactly the right time, when is a revolution justified. I think the more important thing is to sell people on the principle of non-coercion, and then later decide, okay, well, how much coercion do we have to endure before it's justified to try to start a revolution? So I don't have an answer on to exactly when is it justified, but I'm not really concerned about that right now. I think if we get people to sign on to the principle, at least, of what we're aiming for, then everything else is like relative walk in the park. It's
Sure.
pretty.
Okay. with the Walmart example, you had said, okay, well, everyone can get cheap things at Walmart, but the higher end stuff will still sell. Okay, well, there's a golden Walmart, and that sells high end things. I mean, I mean, the same principle is going to apply for any company that has so much money that they're going to dwarf. Forget about bribery. They're just going to dwarf everybody in terms of advertising. Most people aren't going to hear about the rug store, regardless of how much better their rugs are, if the only thing that is blanketing the television ads are ads for Walmart, and everyone, all the 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 reviews of Walmart is, look at how cheap the prices are, look at all the stuff you can get at Walmart. That is likely, obviously not in every case, but is likely to be like, wow, we can go to Golden Walmart and get a $600 chandelier, which everybody is raving about, and the other store that's selling a $600 chandelier might be a better chandelier, but no one is raving about it because no one knows who they are. I just, there's always, in my view, the ability for people who have the most, and again, a lot of it is generational wealth. The current Walmart heirs do nothing. I don't know if they do nothing, but they don't. There's nothing to justify the amount of money that they have, other than the fact that their parents and grandparents did something amazing, and now they are the beneficiaries of those things and are able to just sort of, the best way to make money in the United States is to already have money, and that money is able to roll down the hill much more easily than someone who's starting from nothing. You're not going to I'm not going to sit in my apartment and outcompete Walmart at anything. I just don't have the resource to do that. If I had $1 billion because my father left me $1 billion, I would have the resources. I'd go to the best schools, I'd hire the best people, I'd have a much better chance of being successful at doing that based on nothing that I myself did, only based on my circumstance. And so I think that is so much of an imposition on the way in which we think of meritocracy. That was my general point.
Okay.
Am I rising to the top because I have better ideas than the person down the street? Possibly, but it's possibly because I just have more inherited money, or I have more money that is coming into me because of my name, because my father is Joe Biden. I have more money that is coming to me that allows me to do a lot more things than I would have if my father's name was Joe Smith.
Right. Well, I mean, there's certainly going to be luck, and inherited wealth is part of that, but I don't think it justifies coercion, and I don't think it's in the interest of anyone to overthrow the system that allows such wealth to be made, in favor of equalizing outcomes or even making them more equal. Again, there's an issue of arbitrariness, and I think the principled way of looking at it is, how should people deal with each other, by force or by persuasion? That's the only principled way to figure out how a society should interact. And if you come down on the force side, then there's no way. Then, I mean, you can't come purely down on that side, because then everything just collapses. If people should only deal with each other by force, then we reduce ourselves to animals.
Nobody believes that. I agree.
And if you don't say, okay, we're going to have some mixture of force and reason, then it becomes arbitrary, and there's no way to draw a line. And I think they can ratchet up in terms of, like, taxation in the US. It used to be, nothing in the 19th century, and then they had a little bit in the early 20th century, And it was a big deal that, now we have to pay a few percent on our income. And then decades fast forward, now we're up to like 20%, 30%. And
Right.
there's nothing really to stop it. Once you institute the principle that it's okay sometimes to coerce people, then there's nothing in principle to ever stop it. And it just becomes an unstable mixture. And I think that's where we are right now. We're in a kind of mixed economy, and we could
I don't know
keep
why.
sliding towards more and more governments. We've had a huge growth of governments over the last 100 years with FDR and the so-called Great Society and the Medicare and Social Security. Or we could go back in the direction that allowed us to create so much wealth in the 19th century. I think that's when we had the most progress and innovation. And during that period, we had so much immigration. People were coming to our country, which, a lot on the left will point to the so-called Gilded Age as to this terrible time. But if it was so terrible, then, why did we have all these people flocking to our shores? I think it was for the freedom and the opportunities to make a better lives for themselves. And unfortunately, I think that's less available now. It's much harder. Our immigration laws are much more restrictive than they used to be, and it's harder for people to come here and make a living. And I think the rate of progress has been less than it used to be. In some ways, I think we've gone backwards.
Sure.
I gave you the example in one of my videos of the supersonic flights, which we used to have and is now gone. Whereas in less regulated areas like the tech sector, there's been tremendous growth that allows us to, have things like this Zoom call that we're having right now. So I think introducing some coercion is an arbitrary situation, which allows things to get worse. And I think what we need to do is get back on the non-arbitrary way of thinking things in terms of principles of coercion versus persuasion, and then we can go back to our era of progress.
You're compelling me to say a couple of things in response to that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We won't go on for more than another few minutes. I apologize. After seeing that argument from with that you had with Matt Binder, I looked at the immigration numbers in this country. There was an immigration boom, a substantial one, of something like 13 million people in the late 19th century, or maybe from 1850 onward or 1860 onward. There was a dip during some of the New Deal and Great Society period. The immigration numbers since the mid 1980s have grown at a much higher rate. Not all legal, I'm sure, or maybe it was legal. I don't know. The immigration numbers have skyrocketed something like 5 times since the Reagan era, far more than they were. I don't know if by percentage. Certainly by raw numbers, quite a bit more than during the 19th century. I just want to point that out. That may not disprove anything that you're saying. And yes, there was definitely an influx of immigration in the 19th century. And yes, I do believe there are other factors for that, but it may have been evidence, certainly a data point, in the success of a very free and open society, and the frontier being wide open, and people coming here for a better life, as opposed to lots of war-torn areas around the world, and lots of, not sure you would really say fascist areas in the world. I don't know if that was a 19th century phenomenon as much as, but monarchies and other things around the world. I just want to point out those immigration numbers are actually higher now, and steeper climb now than they were then. Second point I wanted to make is, I don't know why the mixture has to be unstable. I don't know. There's definitely a mixture. It's definitely arbitrary. I don't know why we wouldn't be able to get to some sort of stable mixture in which everyone was relatively happy enough with where we were, and then it would only fluctuate based upon new demographics and other things, just because of the fact that the size of government has gone up doesn't necessarily mean that government should be at something near zero. I know that you don't want it at zero, but I don't see why it would be impossible for a society to get together and have something which people were happy with. I want to bring
Okay.
up. I want to delve for 1 second into your idea of force. So, anecdote example. I'm on my property. I spend my day lighting loud firecrackers. I say that they remind me of my. They're to honor my father who died in a war, and that is my right. They're my firecrackers. I'm not a safety risk. I have a fire extinguisher nearby. It's my property. The house next to mine has 2 small children. The children are terrified by the firecrackers. They don't want to go outside and play. They're getting traumatized by this. Like they can hear them sometimes when they're in the house studying. They don't want to do their homework. All they want to do is go around with headphones and listen to music all day because they're being traumatized by this. So my neighbor comes to me and says, "Can you please stop lighting these firecrackers? They're too loud for my children." And I say, "Okay, I mean, I understand your concern, but no, this is my property. It's my freedom. I can do what I want to." Now, sound is definitely not force. If sound were force, then you couldn't. There's a million things that you wouldn't be able to do. I am using complete freedom to do what I want to, but I am inhibiting the freedom of the person, the neighbor next to me, who has to pay money for a psychologist for their children, have to pay money for special earphones or whatever to be able to protect her children. There is no force that I can tell is occurring, but there is harm. What are your thoughts on a situation like that? I mean, I'm not doing
Okay.
anything illegal. The fireworks are legal. The property's mine. So
Yeah.
no court is gonna find me in violation of anything. How would you handle a situation like that?
Okay. Before I get to that, I want to say something about the immigration and the
Sure.
other point about unstableness you brought up. So I do think it's what's relevant, even if the absolute numbers of immigrants are up, how many of those are legal? You did say, well, many of those might be illegal. And that I think is a problem. I don't think people should have to come here in the shadows or in fear of being deported after having built a life here. If
I,
they're not posing any physical threat, either as as a terrorist or as carrying some kind of disease with them, then
yeah,
I
I
think
can
it's within their rights.
stipulate that I am not a, I don't think people should be criminalized for crossing a border.
And I don't think they need or necessarily want in many cases help from the government. I don't think they have any rights any more than Americans. I don't think Americans have a right to handouts from the government. I think they can come here and work and make their own. And again, this goes back to the minimum wage. People should be able to hire them for less than minimum wage if that's the only way for them to get a job. I think that should be within their rights. And if we didn't have minimum wage, then maybe more of them could come here and be self-sustaining. So as a percentage of world population, that's also relevant. So even if more are coming here, well, the world's population has also exploded over the last century. We're like around 8 billion now. I don't know what it was back in the 19th century. So
I
if there are
I
millions,
think there are still more coming now, even relative to the population of the world, but it's basically an irrelevant distinction. It is basically the case in which, yes, there were immigrants back then, there are immigrants now. They were both in high numbers. I just wanted to point out that we, like, not every single data point is a confirmation of your theory, because sometimes sometimes immigrants have come to what you would argue to be a very government heavy regulated society, and sometimes they came to what you believe to be a very government light, unregulated society, and in both in substantial enough numbers to be able to register on a chart, regardless of which is larger.
But look at where they're coming from. I think that's also relevant. Even if America is more regulated today than it was in the 19th century, it still, I think, offers more freedom and opportunities than many other places, like in Central America. So it's not the case. They could still be coming here for freedom, even if we're less free than we used to be. We're still more free than the alternatives that they have where they're coming from. So I think if we compare where people immigrating to, like, would people in general rather immigrate to the US or to Mexico? I think there's something to be drawn from that. I think most of the immigration is going in one direction. And let me go on to the second point about unstable. Can't we have a stable mixture of freedom and coercion? I don't think we can. I think there's always going to be a push. Like if right now, maybe the main political camps in the U.S. are Democrats and Republicans, or it might be put in terms of liberals and conservatives. But then, on one side, you've got progressives pulling the liberals further in one direction, and then even further, you've got the communists pulling on the progressives. And then maybe on the other side, on the so-called right, you've got more moderate and then less moderate. There's always going to be some tug. And I think the reason there is that there's not really any principal difference between any of these camps. There's only one consistent alternative at the root of all political issues, which is freedom versus coercion. I think that is the fundamental alternative or the fundamental issue in politics. That gets to the essence. And so I don't think it can be stable, because there's no reason for it to be stable. The only reasoned position, I think, is total freedom or total control, total persuasion or total coercion.
Reason for it to be stable would be a majority of people elect a legislature that would do that, and that legislature keeps getting elected because the people find that mixture popular. Stabilize it.
Okay, but when you go into the reasons, why do they find it popular? They're not going to have a principled position for that mixture. I don't think there's a consistent argument to sustain and to make people want to continue voting for a certain type of politician. And that, unless they have a good argument for that arbitrary mixture, and I don't think there is a good argument, I don't think it's going to be able to last.
The ratings of Game of Thrones for the first 4 seasons were super high. For the last 4 seasons, people started to hate the show, but they still watched because they were invested in seeing the outcome of what happened to the characters, and it was still an event on television. It doesn't matter sometimes what the reason is, that people will do something if it's a binary choice. But okay, I'll stipulate that as well, so we can end soon.
Okay, and I guess to go to the last point of your Firecracker example, you say that's not force. It's not violating any law. Well, it could be violating a law. I mean, there could be nuisance laws, like you're not allowed to have noise over a certain decibel level in a neighborhood. But I think the issue of force, it can be a little tricky in certain cases, and I think this is one of them. Fraud is another kind of case. So it's sometimes said that fraud is a form of force in the objectivist literature. That is, people will sometimes point to fraud. Well, I didn't like punch somebody in the face, so did I really use force against him if I sold him some defective goods? true, you didn't punch someone in the face, but you also didn't respect his voluntary agreement. You gave him a certain product. Let's say you sell him some food, some meat, on the understanding that it's not contaminated with some kind of bacteria,
I'm
and that's the condition under which he gave you money in exchange for that meat. So if it turns out the meat is contaminated,
right.
then and you knew that's a form of fraud,
Violated
and you can be.
contract. I understand. Well, I the I'm interested. You want a police force to protect against against the thug that is that is breaking into houses. You want to have a military to protect against the foreigners that want to invade the country. Why would you not want government institutions to protect against people getting cancer by 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 bad products? Why would you not want a government to protect people against losing their homes because of medical bankruptcy? Why would you not want to have a government that protects people from the not exactly force, but the systemic the systemic inchipits that are against them that could cause them the same harm as somebody could with a gun? Why would you not want a government that would protect people against unsafe air, or protect people from getting a substandard get from not being able to use a ramp to get into a building, and they have a wheelchair? Why would you not want government agencies that are able to protect people against those sorts of harm, even if they're not specifically forced, if you are against fraud?
Well, I don't think those some of the examples you just gave, like a ramp to a building, involves any fraud. Like if I build a store and I don't choose to provide access for wheelchairs, I haven't engaged in any fraud. I haven't tried to sell you something under false pretenses.
I'm not
I've
saying
said,
I'm not saying all of them are fraud. I'm saying that all of them are harm in some kind of way, in which, if the government is there, the government that you want to have is there to protect people from forcibly losing their homes to marauders, how about from losing their homes to medical bankruptcy?
well, not giving someone a benefit is not a harm. Like if I don't give you a positive, that's not a negative I'm imposing on you. It's just the absence of a positive. So if I don't provide the person in a wheelchair with a ramp, he's no worse off than if I hadn't built the building at all in the first place. So I'm not harming him. I'm just not helping him. And I don't think it's the government's role to force anybody to help somebody else. It's only the role of the government to stop people from harming physically other people.
If the person in the wheelchair can't get up the ramp to do business at that store, and it's not just one store, it's most of the stores in a town, for example, isn't everybody else being given an added advantage of having more competition, more ability to do business, more ability to shop for the lowest prices, which the person in the wheelchair is being denied by nature, essentially?
There certainly are advantages that other people are going to have, but there's also, I don't think that's something that we should use coercion to mitigate against. People who are beautiful, they're just born genetically, they look better than other people. They're at an advantage in certain ways. They have an easier time getting jobs as models, or as dating opportunities are more abundant for them. But I don't think we should try to equalize things by uglifying them, or forcing someone to pay for plastic surgery so someone else can be as beautiful as they are. So I think equality is a false, or not a good goal to aim at if it means equality of opportunity or looks. What I think matters is equality of rights before the law. Otherwise, I don't think there's maybe it's another one of these slippery slopes where there's really no principled way to stop a slide into total control.
Sure, the person who in the wheelchair has the right to go into the store, They just can't. Is essentially what you're saying. It seems like it's a relatively hollow victory. Oh, I
I'm
have a
not
right.
saying they have a right to go into the store. I'm
I
saying
mean,
no one has.
they have a right to engage in commerce voluntarily, but if they physically can't, okay. I didn't want to bring up a
I
topic
mean,
of real
they
contention.
have a right to not be coercively interfered with. That's the kind of right I think they have, and no one is coercively interfering with them by not giving them some kind of benefit.
All right, thank you, Dan. It's been a long period of time. Hopefully your stuff didn't get ruined, and hopefully it's not raining too hard.
No, it's not raining hard, and my stuff did not get ruined. I did not. I feel like I didn't fully address the point about the firecrackers. I think they might
Sure,
be
please do.
like I don't know if there's a way to so it might be one of these kind of borderline gray cases like fraud where it's kind of related or close to force, but anyways, it's preventing people from acting in a way that they voluntarily would choose to. So if someone comes into a community, they sign a lease agreement with the homeowners association or something on the understanding that there's not going to be loud noises like firecrackers, yet someone is using their firecrackers, then they're interfering with the voluntary agreement, with the voluntary choices of the person. So I guess
Oh,
in a
okay.
way,
So
the issue of
one person
it,
says, my
in a way,
firecracker.
the issue of voluntariness, I think, is maybe more helpful than the issue of coercion here. People should be able to act as they choose, as they voluntarily decide, and that's what they're being prevented from doing by the firecrackers.
I had just tried to set up the situation in which I'm not breaking any laws. I could say, I mean, maybe the law is not written in terms of decibels. I can say my firecrackers aren't that loud, but that still doesn't mean it's not going to traumatize a child, even if it is within the legal permutations of what the community may allow. I'm not breaking any laws, but I am doing something that is causing harm to someone nearby.
Yeah, well, I think it would be written into the laws that you have to have a certain noise level or not go above a certain noise level. And that, maybe that's not foreseen because it just didn't occur to anyone at first. But over time, the laws evolve. Like there are things like the internet that didn't exist 100 years ago. And now we have laws that deal with, okay, you can use it in this way and not in that way. So I think people would come up with laws to deal with these sorts of cases.
It's just the case in which someone who is phobic of loud noises is may not matter whether or not the person next to them that's lighting firecrackers all the time is within the proper ordinance of the law. It's going to be traumatic regardless of even if they're quiet enough to avoid violating anything. I mean, maybe this is not a perfect example. I'm just there have to be examples of, you know, I decide to put up a fence on my property because it's my property, and the person behind me who paid money for a view is now having that view obscured by the fence. There's no force at all in that situation. Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, things like this, I think they have to be spelled out in contracts, and people have to think, it's part of the challenge of making a good contract is to consider things like this. And like, what are going to be the effects on the view that other people have? And you try to work that out as best you can in contracts so people know what they're getting into and they can get what they're signing up for.
all right. Thanks very much, Dan, for your patience and for hosting me for doing this. And if you have any other questions for me or anything, if not, then we can end.
Uh, I'm ready to end here. This was good, I thought, and thank you for coming on. I appreciate the discussion, and I think we covered some issues which I don't think I've covered before, at least not in exactly the same way. And I'm always happy to get some more new sorts of content. So thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
All right, take care.